This is former US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, at 100 years old, meeting with the current leader of China, Xi Jinping. The visit occurred during a time of some rising tensions between the USA and China, yet Kissinger, as a Westerner, is welcomed as an old friend by the President of China himself.
As far as the Chinese are concerned, their primary interest is China, always China. That's number one. Their secondary interest is philosophy. It doesn't mean that Mao Zedong was not a very dedicated Marxist communist, call him what you want. And the same is true of Zhou Enlai. But where there is conflict between the ideology and their security comes first. And as far as we were concerned, we were their ideological enemy. But on the other hand, as far as the security of China was concerned, we were absolutely indispensable in that security.
This is much to the chagrin of the US government, by the way. John Kirby, a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council, said, quote, "It's unfortunate that a private citizen can meet with a defense minister and have a communication that the United States can't." This was in reference to Kissinger's meeting with Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu, who is currently being sanctioned by the US for buying Russian weapons in 2017, and because of these sanctions he won't talk to them. However, Shangfu would speak with Kissinger, who himself was acting as an unofficial representative of the US, a politically convenient middleman, with all the experience of US-Chinese diplomacy, yet none of the political commitment. A few weeks later, though, Kissinger was dead, and China mourned his loss, referring to him again as old friend. Even on Chinese social media, there was pretty great outpour of respect for the old diplomat, more so than you might see on Western social medias. Kissinger had allegedly visited China over 100 times, and clearly amassed significant amount of good faith within the country. So the question is, why do they like him so much? Well, we need to build some context.
The communist victory has been won in the face of what 2 years before seemed insurmountable obstacles.
Together, the dragon and the bear control the lives of more than 1 billion people, 1 out of every 3 persons living on the earth. As the years go by, Red China sees itself not as a satellite, but as an equal partner and an independent spokesman for world communism.
We must recognize that the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States have had great differences. But what we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war.
The story starts in the 1950s. The communists have won the civil war in China, and their leader, Mao Zedong, declares the creation of the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, right on the doorstep of the Soviet Union. Now, all of a sudden, there are 2 giant neighbouring countries who fly the red banner of communism, and because of their shared ideology, they begin to work together. In February of 1950, China and the USSR signed a 30-year treaty of friendship, which promised that either side would provide total support to the other if they were to be attacked by Japan or, quote, any state allied with it. The Soviet Union would also send China a loan worth $300 million to be repaid at 1% interest, in order to help restore its economy. They'd also send advisors and military technologies to help the fledgling nation, which, after a brutal war with the Japanese, combined with a civil war, was left in absolute shambles. In terms of leadership, the relationship between Mao and Stalin was complicated. While both were revered communist figureheads in their country, Mao privately had some qualms about Stalin, since he believed that Stalin did not view the two as equals. Mao would later say to a Soviet ambassador, a guy called Pavel Yudin, quote, "You Russians never had faith in the Chinese people, and Stalin was among the worst." That being said, as a whole, Sino-Soviet relations during that Stalinist era were mostly positive. That, however, would change. When Joseph Stalin died, Nikita Khrushchev became his successor. Mao did not like Khrushchev. He believed that Khrushchev, as well as the rest of the Soviet leadership, were unfit to lead the international communist movement. Mao instead thought that that right naturally belonged to himself. Khrushchev then began an era of de-Stalinization to break down the cult of personality that surrounded Stalin. This spooked Mao, who had created a personality cult of his own in China. He slammed Khrushchev and the Soviet administration for being revisionists. Mao defended Stalin, saying that he had been correct in about 70% of his policies, and that his mistakes were about 30%. He went farther, saying that Stalinism was just Marxism with shortcomings, that de-Stalinization was thus simply de-Marxification. This was the beginning of the end for any kind of Soviet-Sino friendship. From here, paranoia between the two began to fester. In 1958, the Soviets proposed a jointly owned submarine force to the Chinese, after the Chinese had asked for assistance in building their own independent force. The Soviets had also wanted to build a jointly owned radar system in China. This, for the Chinese, represented a threat to their own sovereignty. They weren't quite comfortable letting the Soviets expand their influence under the guise of a jointly owned endeavour on Chinese land. By 1959, the Soviet Union reneged on their promise to help China with their nuclear weapons program. See, the Soviets were negotiating with the US on a nuclear test ban treaty, and Moscow didn't want to endanger these negotiations by helping China build up their weapons. Moscow justified it by saying China couldn't afford nuclear weapons anyways, and that if it came to it, the Soviets had enough bombs for them both. From the Chinese perspective though, this treaty merely represented Soviet collusion with the Americans in order to restrain China. So, if the late 50s were poor for the Sino-Soviet relationship, the 60s would be absolutely disastrous. See, the problem was the border. Kind of. So way back in 1860, China is the Qing dynasty and their neighbour is the Russian Empire. And these two signed a Treaty of Peking, which meant that China basically had to give a lot of land to the Russians. The new border between the two now laid at the Amur and Ussuri rivers. Now there were two problems here. One was the treaty was viewed as extremely unequal, which was forced on a much weaker China. And two, there was differing interpretations on who actually owned the islands that were on the river border. One particular island was Zhenbao Island, which the Russians called the Mansky Island, but it's the same thing. Anyways, Communist China argued that this island was rightfully theirs, but the Soviets disagreed. And by the way, this island is like completely strategically useless, but since relations were souring between China and the USSR, it served as a convenient excuse to air grievances from underlying issues. So Khrushchev is ousted by 1964, and things with China don't improve under the new leader, Leonid Brezhnev, like people might have hoped. By 1965, the Soviets increased their military presence near China, even signing a defense treaty with Mongolia, allowing its troops to be stationed there. The Soviets even positioned the SS-12 nuclear weapons system at the border, which had a 500-mile radius and a 500-kiloton warhead. The Chinese had divisions at the border too, and they actually outnumbered the Soviets, but they weren't well armed and they weren't motorized. Of course, in Mao's view, this didn't matter, since according to him, it's men that win wars and not material. To Mao, creativity, flexibility, and high morale were the keys for an effective army, as opposed to fancy high-tech weapons. Now, Chinese military doctrine actually had to have this kind of philosophy, since the only resource they had in abundance was people. Anyways, in August of 1968, Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia to stop a trend of reformation that could threaten communist rule. China condemned the attack as a, quote, crime of aggression, continuing that it was the most barefaced and most typical specimen of fascist power politics played by the Soviet revisionist clique of renegades. This, combined with the Brezhnev doctrine, which stated that Soviets could just intervene in European socialist countries whenever they deemed it necessary, made China nervous, since this could be used to send an incursion into Albania or Romania, which were the only European states that China had friendly relations with. But it was in 1969 where things got really desperate. In the opening months of 1969, the Soviets fired warning shots at a Chinese patrol on the previously mentioned Zhenbao Island. As a response, on March 2nd, 300 Chinese troops opened fire on the Soviets on what's described as an ambush. The fighting lasted almost 2 hours before the Soviets finally managed to get the Chinese to retreat. It's thought that the reason for this attack was to publicly show Moscow that China wasn't afraid. Mao wanted to flex his muscles a bit, kill a few Soviets, and deter any future provocations. In other words, Mao wanted to teach the Soviets a lesson. For the Soviets though, this was seen as a highly aggressive move, highlighting just how anti-Soviet Mao had become. So about 2 weeks later, on March 15th, another skirmish broke out on Zhenbao. Of course, both sides blame each other, but this time it's thought that it was the Soviets who started in order to teach China a lesson. The firefight lasted about 9 hours. The Chinese had about 2,000 men, but the Soviets brought out some fancy new equipment, like the then top-secret T-62 tank and the BM-21 rocket system, both of which was joined by a healthy dose of artillery and air support. As you can see, the two countries were now locked into an increasingly tense situation. Despite this, Moscow didn't want a wide-scale war. They tried to negotiate with China multiple times after the incident, while China's response was to just basically brush them off or ignore them. So the Soviets ramped up their nuclear rhetoric. Though when pressed on the matter, the Soviets denied any allegations of doing this as, quote, provocative false rumors. So the Soviets would fall into this cycle of making thinly veiled nuclear threats, and then when they were asked about it, just flat out deny that they ever did it. But it should be remembered that China had no answer to the Soviet nuclear question. Mao flipped from not believing they'd be used, like chemical weapons in the Second World War, to if they were used, wouldn't largely affect the war's result. But it's important to know that they kind of had to say this in order to keep morale high. But China didn't take the prospect of war all that seriously either. A memo to Mao written by Zhou Enlai stated that the Soviets were merely making a, quote, empty show of strength designed to make others watch. By April, the border had been relatively quiet and negotiations had opened back up. But for the negotiations to be successful, the Chinese had demanded that the Soviets admit that the current treaties were unequal. Naturally, there was no way the Soviets were going to do that, so any agreement looked unlikely. By the summer, tensions flared high again, with numerous accounts of conflicts taking place. One of the most serious of which was when the Soviets, aided by APCs, tanks and 2 helicopters, killed 38 Chinese soldiers, to show Beijing that they couldn't keep getting away with any provocations at the border. The Soviets continued their nuclear saber-rattling, but this time they did it in a way that deeply unnerved China. In August of 1969, at a lunch meeting in Washington, William Stearman, a State Department official, met with Boris Davidov, Second Secretary of the Soviet Embassy. At this informal discussion, the Soviet asked point blank what America's reaction would be if the USSR launched a preemptive strike on China's nuclear installations. Spearman, taken aback somewhat, asked if Davidov was serious. He replied that he was completely serious. He went on to say that 2 objectives would be achieved. One was destroying the Chinese nuclear threat for decades, and 2 was that the Mao clique would become discredited. He also stressed that this wouldn't affect the US and that America would have nothing to fear. Davidov apparently also said that he thought that the US was opposed to the spread of nuclear weapons, to which Spearman replied that the US did want to stop such a spread, but that nuking China's facilities was, quote, quite another thing altogether. But the prospect of such an act did cause quite a stir in the Nixon administration. The question had to be thought about. How would America respond? To pick one side over the other too strongly would destroy prospects of diplomacy with the other, so the US wanted to take the middle road where at all possible. Now, Henry Kissinger agreed that neutrality was the best option, but leaned towards the Chinese side, feeling that in the long term, they were on their way towards a more, quote, rational relationship with the US. Regardless, the State Department were unconvinced about Soviet intentions of a sudden preemptive strike on China. While they didn't rule it out as a possibility, the reason that the chances of this line of action was, quote, substantially less than 50-50, and that escalation from border clashes was more likely. Meanwhile, China caught wind of the Soviet Union's probes, and it put the fear of God into them. While the Chinese initially didn't believe much in the Soviet saber-rattling, when they discovered that the Soviets were floating the idea around to foreign governments, that was just a step too far. Particularly when they got confirmation from the US. CIA Director Richard Helms told the press that the Soviets had been approaching communist governments in Eastern Europe about an attack on China's nuclear program. He conveniently left out that they had also asked the Americans. Anyways, China lost their minds at this revelation. They immediately issued orders for war preparations, building air raid shelters, stockpiling basic necessities, planning evacuations from major cities, and ordering a general mobilization in the border provinces. The people were told that they, quote, must be fully prepared to fight a war against aggression. China had only a handful of nukes by this point, and even those were the old kind that had to be carried by plane, so they weren't really any kind of threat. So instead, Beijing relied on its massive population and a threat of an all-out people's war as a deterrence. The idea being that anything the Soviets hoped to achieve with a first strike would be completely negated by a massive drawn-out conflict that could last years. In an official statement by the Chinese government, Beijing warned that, quote, should a handful of war maniacs dare to raid China's strategic sites in defiance of world condemnation, that will be war. That will be aggression. And the 700 million Chinese people will rise up in resistance and use revolutionary war to eliminate the war of aggression. It's not clear if Moscow was seriously considering striking China, even if they were kind of thinking about it. It's more accepted that they were just floating the idea around to others to scare China onto the negotiation table. This actually worked, as China finally agreed to talk seriously, but it had made them intensely paranoid, afraid that at any moment, the Soviets would launch a surprise attack. The ordeal for China was a bit of a wake-up call, proof that it needed to rethink its foreign policy. It couldn't remain isolated from both the USSR and the United States. The fact of the matter was, it needed friends. So it's now 1971, and a curious breakthrough in politics would happen here, in Nagoya, Japan, at, of all places, the 31st World Table Tennis Championships. So this American player, a 19-year-old Glenn Cowan, gets on the Chinese team's shuttle bus. There, he talks with the Chinese star player, Zhuang Zedong, and they get on so well that Zhuang gave Cowan a gift of a silk-screen picture of China's Huangshan Mountains. Now, Zhuang wasn't really supposed to do that, since for the Chinese, fraternizing with the Americans was not quite allowed. Nevertheless, the next day, Cowan returns the favour by giving Zhuang a t-shirt with the peace symbol and the words "Let it be." Now, this became talk of the tournament, and it surprised everybody. When word reached Beijing, it even surprised Zhou Enlai and Mao, who initially were just going to kind of ignore it. But then Mao changed his mind, and personally approved the invitation of the US ping pong team to China. Mao commented that Zhuang Zedong is not only very good at ping pong, but also quite diplomatic. So the American team gets permission from the State Department, and then by April 10th, they cross from Hong Kong into China. Americans in China wasn't unheard of, but it was a real rarity. The trip was 10 days, and they spent the time sightseeing in what was for them a totally alien environment. Of course, they also competed in a bunch of exhibition ping pong matches. The US team was not particularly elite in terms of skill, especially compared to the Chinese at the time, who were just first class. But the Chinese, even while winning the majority of games, quote-unquote, lost a few out of good sportsmanship. As the Chinese put it, it was, quote, friendship first, competition second. The trip ended at Beijing's Great Hall of Heroes, where the team actually met face-to-face with Zhou Enlai. Apparently, Glenn Cowan, the player who had gotten on the bus from before, raised his hand and asked Zhou Enlai what he thought of the American hippie movement. Zhou Enlai was supposedly stunned for a moment before saying, quote, "Youth wants to seek truth, and out of this search, various forms of change are bound to come forth. When we were young, it was the same too." The press had dubbed the tour ping pong diplomacy, and the newly found goodwill quickly bore fruit, as President Nixon lifted trade embargoes and travel bans to the PRC. Now, Nixon himself was a staunch anti-communist, but made no secret about wanting to establish a relationship with China. In 1967, Nixon wrote an essay titled Asia After Vietnam, where he discusses the nations in the Pacific, their future, their security concerns, and the US's role in the region. On the topic of China, Nixon says this: "Any American policy towards Asia must come urgently to grips with the reality of China. This does not mean, as many would simplistically have it, rushing to grant recognition to Peking, to admit it to the United Nations, and to ply it with offers of trade, all of which would serve to confirm its rulers in their present course. It does mean recognizing the present and potential danger from communist China, and taking measures designed to meet that danger. It also means distinguishing carefully between long-range and short-range policies, and fashioning short-range programs so as to advance our long-range goals. Taking the long view, we simply cannot afford to leave China forever outside of the family of nations, there to nurture its fantasies, cherish its hates, and threaten its neighbours. There is no place on this small planet for 1 billion of its potentially most able people to live in angry isolation. But we could go disastrously wrong if, in pursuing this long-range goal, we failed in the short range to read the lessons of history. The world cannot be safe until China changes. Thus, our aim, to the extent that we can influence events, should be to induce change. The way to do this is to persuade China that it must change, that it cannot satisfy its imperial ambitions, and that its own national interest requires a turning away from foreign adventuring and a turning inward toward the solution of its own domestic problems. So Nixon wanted to delicately establish some kind of connection with the PRC. Now, there had been some communication between China and the USA before the whole ping-pong diplomacy thing. There were numerous dialogues in Geneva and Warsaw, but these didn't really go anywhere. Nixon needed something solid. In 1969, Nixon sent a message to the Chinese via a mutual friend, none other than Charles de Gaulle, the French general of World War II. This message indicated that the US wished to normalize relations. Nixon really admired and respected de Gaulle, but he was chosen to give the message mainly because the Chinese loved him. In August of 1969, he spoke with the Romanian president, Nicolae Ceausescu, about the need for new Sino-US relations. After a lengthy discussion, the Romanian president agreed to pass on the word to Beijing. But there was another way of reaching the Chinese, and that was through Pakistan. More specifically, the Pakistani president, Yahya Khan. This line of communication actually got its own name, became known as the Yahya channel, and it served as a reliable back channel between Nixon and Zhou Enlai. And by the way, all of this communicating was done in intense secrecy. Only a handful of people knew about it. After all, it was still the Cold War, and when you're trying to make a long-term geopolitical play like this, you don't want anyone messing it up. Anyways, by the early 70s, Nixon and Zhou Enlai messaged back and forth about furthering the Chinese-US relationship. But China's main concern was that of Taiwan, which China saw as its own rightful territory, and they made that absolutely clear. This put the US in a tricky situation, since they still had commitments to Taiwan, but they also wanted to keep dialogue open with the PRC, and this was a difficult balancing act. But things at least looked promising, as Beijing expressed interest at receiving a special envoy to try hash things out in person. It was then when Nixon caught word that the US ping pong team got invited to China in 1971. Nixon wrote, quote, "I was as surprised as I was pleased by this news. I had never expected that the Chinese initiative would come to fruition in the form of a ping pong team." In April, China sent word via Pakistan reaffirming its willingness to receive a direct envoy from the US. The next month, in May of 1971, the US replied that Nixon was prepared to accept Zhou's invitation for talks. Nixon proposed that Henry Kissinger ought to make a secret visit first to arrange an agenda and begin a preliminary exchange of views, and the Chinese accepted this. Now this was huge. After months of effort, Nixon finally had his foot in the door. All they needed to do now was get Kissinger over there and make sure nobody found out about it. So they devised this entire plan where Kissinger would make a routine trip to Asia and then stop off by Pakistan. There, in Pakistan, he'd pretend to have a stomachache and told everyone he'd need a few days to recover. In those few days of, quote, recovery, he'd sneak off to China to have talks. And wouldn't you know it, they actually pulled it off. Henry Kissinger got to China and no one was the wiser. Now, Kissinger would be speaking mostly to Zhou Enlai, and if you don't know who that is, he is a major deal in the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, a seasoned veteran. Zhou gave Mao his full public support at the Zunyi Conference in 1935 during the Long March, and since then the two have been extremely close, placing Zhou in a uniquely powerful position. He became the first premier of the PRC in 1949, and was generally very popular, both internally in China and externally with foreign countries. He did have some close calls during the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, where the entire country was just in turmoil and Maoist extremists tried to attack him. But he did survive that and maintain his positive reputation. So really all you need to know here is that Kissinger wasn't talking to just some diplomat. He was talking to like the second or third most important person in China. Anyways, Kissinger's immediate report back to Nixon on July 11th, 1971 said this, quote, "Conversations were the most intense, important and far-reaching of my White House experience." He continued, quote, "Talks on other subjects, including one of particular concern, very encouraging, but too sensitive for cable." He ended the report by saying, quote, "Please keep everyone steady. Other side made special point about need to keep word meticulously. They will not understand even a minor leak and will consider it a deliberate affront and proof of unreliability." Now this was a promising first taste, but Kissinger's next report 3 days later was far more thorough, and it's an absolutely fascinating read. He starts it off by saying, quote, "My 2-day visit to Peking resulted in the most searching, sweeping and significant discussions I have ever had in government." He continued, quote, "It is extremely difficult to capture in a memorandum the essence of this experience. Simply giving you a straightforward account of the highlights of our talks, potentially momentous as they were, would do violence to an event so shaped by the atmosphere and the ebb and flow of our encounter, or to the Chinese behavior, so dependent on nuances and style." Kissinger is in awe of the place, and his report kind of reflects that. He describes the environment as very relaxed, cordial and matter-of-fact. He gives a very in-depth account of his conversations with Zhou Enlai, as well as some outside-the-lines analysis of some of what was said. In repeating the report, I'll break it into 3 parts. 1, the discussions around geopolitics, each nation's interests and perspectives. 2, Kissinger's wider take on the Chinese in general, as well as how they differ from the Soviets. And 3, Kissinger's own opinions of Zhou Enlai. For 2 and 3, I'll be using a briefing Kissinger made a year later, in 1972, just to add a little more context that I think is interesting. So, Zhou Enlai described that the basic issue between the US and PRC is that of Taiwan. Zhou laid out 4 points that will become a prerequisite to establish US-Chinese relations. 1, recognize that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. 2, recognize the PRC as the only legitimate government of China. 3, withdraw all armed forces and military installations from Taiwan. And 4, consider that the US Republic of China Mutual Defense Treaty is invalid. So Kissinger first replied that this was more than the Chinese had asked for previously, but didn't dwell on that point and continued on saying that they had to distinguish what could be done immediately and what had to be left to, quote, historical evolution. But Kissinger starts off in regards to the US military presence in Taiwan. He says that there were 2 components to this presence. 1 was in relation to the defense of Southeast Asia, and 2, the actual defense of Taiwan itself. He says that forces in relation to Vietnam could simply be taken away after the war ends, but that the forces that are there to defend Taiwan, what happens to them would have to depend on the US's general relations with the People's Republic of China. Zhou asked Kissinger if he was, quote, linking the Taiwan issue to Indochina. When Kissinger affirmed that he was, Zhou didn't raise any protests. Kissinger says that the US didn't advocate for 2 Chinas or a 1 China, 1 Taiwan solution, but would instead accept any, quote, political evolution agreed by the 2 parties, meaning Taiwan and China. He said that he hoped this evolution would be peaceful, and Zhou said that, quote, the PRC would try to keep it so. Kissinger said that the recognition of the PRC as the sole government of China could not be a condition of Nixon's visit to China. Apparently, after much give and take, Zhou relented, saying that this point was not a precondition, but said that, quote, the visit should set recognition as the ultimate direction of US policy. Zhou accepted that this could take some time, and Kissinger gives him the time frame of well in Nixon's second term. However, Zhou says that if China is to be patient in this regard, it did need some assurances. 1, that the US would not support any 2 China policies. 2, that they wouldn't support any indigenous Taiwanese independence movement. And 3, that no Japanese troops would move into Taiwan. Kissinger stressed that this would be our policy, meaning not allowing Japanese troops in, but noted that any events in Taiwan could be outside the US's ability to control. Zhou, again, didn't raise any objections. They also talked about Communist China's potential admission in the UN. See, at this point, the Taiwanese government officially held a seat representing China at the United Nations, even though the Communist government had control of all the mainland. This would change very quickly, later that year in fact, but by the time this conversation was happening, Taiwan was still the official government of China in the eyes of the UN. Anyways, Zhou Enlai apparently says that the PRC didn't really care about getting into the UN. Quote, it had lived without the UN for 21 years and could continue to do so. However, if others asked, it, quote, would of course maintain its stand that its legitimate rights in the UN be restored. So, just a bit of context on this one. America is still at war in Vietnam, and they're trying to have talks with the North Vietnamese in Paris to try and end it. North Vietnam, referred to here as Hanoi, because their communists have gotten some support from China, referred to here as Peking. From the US position, if America could close some ties with China, then it might make North Vietnam quicken a peace agreement. Anyways, Kissinger's opening here I think is pretty interesting. Quote, Zhou Enlai was as forthcoming as we could have hoped. His attitude throughout reflected the ambivalence of Peking's position. For ideological reasons, he clearly had to support Hanoi. On the other hand, it was apparent that he did not wish to jeopardize the chances for an improvement in our relations. Supposedly, Zhou Enlai switched from a soft stance on Indochina to a harder stance to a soft stance again. Kissinger talked about how 2/3 of US forces in Taiwan were linked to the war, and that their removal would depend on an end of the conflict. He also said an end to the war would, quote, accelerate the improvement of US-Sino relations. However, Kissinger also pointed out that negotiations in Paris were stalled, and that if things broke down there, the war would continue with, quote, incalculable consequences. Zhou asked a bunch of questions on the US situation in Vietnam in a, quote, intelligent and sympathetic manner. These questions were as follows as Kissinger had written them. Quote, were we really ready to pull out? Would we close all of our bases? Why would we wish to leave a tail, such as some advisors and or the Thieu government? Would we prepare to have the Indo-Chinese people determine their own future? Why did we wish a ceasefire? And would we wish to continue giving aid to the present government? Zhou Enlai told Kissinger that China really only had two objectives on any Vietnam settlement. One, there must be a withdrawal of US and Allied forces, and two, the peoples of the three Indo-Chinese countries must be left to decide their own future. Now, the next day, Zhou apparently came back with a bit of a tougher stance. It sounds like he gave Kissinger a bit of a lecture and accused America of committing aggression in Indochina since World War II. That being said, Zhou was also extremely concerned about escalation and made it clear that China would not be intervening. Zhou explained several times that Chinese support to Hanoi never included combat forces, just some, quote, bridge building and road repair crews. Kissinger continues, quote, he stressed that there were no Chinese advisors in Indochina, nor would there be. The last day, Zhou returned to a more sympathetic tone on the topic of Indochina, wishing Kissinger good luck on their negotiations with the Vietnamese in Paris. He said that he hoped the US withdrawal would be, quote, thorough and honorable, and said that the US could find Hanoi to be, quote, more generous than we believed, which means that China would try to exert some influence to assist the US. Japan represented a profound concern for China, namely Japanese remilitarism, which China saw as a massive security risk. Remember, the Japanese rampaged through China during World War II, committing atrocities and killing either directly or indirectly about 20 million people. That kind of horror stays in the national psyche, and China wanted to make sure it never happened again. By the 70s, Japan's economy was doing exceptionally well, and the concern for China was that in the wake of this new economic power, that rearmament was soon to follow. Zhou made the point that economic expansionism would lead to, quote, political expansionism. Zhou spoke of how Sato, Japan's prime minister, had talked about the defense of Taiwan, Okinawa, and Korea as being essential to the defense of Japan. Zhou worried that Japanese troops might even go to Taiwan. He also spoke of his concern about the possibility of the US, USSR, and Japan colluding with each other to, quote, carve up China. He held the position that the US was responsible for Japanese trends and policy which could threaten China. Kissinger, however, stated that the US were not encouraging and, quote, indeed opposed any revival of Japanese expansionism, that the US shared the PRC's interests in managing Japanese growth. Remember, the US had its own problems with Japan in the 40s. However, Kissinger says that all the US supported was Japan's ability to defend itself. He also said that the US had no interest at all in carving up China. Zhou asked Kissinger that no Japanese troops should replace US troops in Taiwan should the US pull out from there, and Kissinger reassured him that there wouldn't be. Kissinger seems to believe that Zhou understands the restraining role the US has on the Japanese. Zhou didn't say all that much about Korea, apart from concerns about hostilities in the area and his desire to get something better than a ceasefire there. Kissinger basically says that the US presence in Korea depended on general relationships in the area, that it was conceivable that most US troops could be pulled out in Nixon's second term if things were good. Though Kissinger also said it would be helpful for peace in the area if the PRC could restrain North Korea and its, quote, harsh military measures against US and allied forces. Zhou didn't really reply to that, and Kissinger remarks, quote, I think that his silence may be taken as a form of dissent. He could hardly admit that an ally of the PRC was behaving aggressively. India, again, was a cause of great concern for China, because of their perceived expansionist policies, against not only China, but Pakistan as well, who were an ally of China. Kissinger basically says that the US were doing all it could to discourage an India-Pakistan war. Zhou appreciated this, but said that the US might just be too far away to do much. China was much closer, and if it came to it, he hinted, could halt expansionism as it had done before. This was in reference to a border war the Chinese had with India in 1962, by the way. Apparently, contempt of India came out loud and clear in conversation, while the warm friendship with Pakistan was also clear. Kissinger supposes that the lesson was, quote, those that stand by China and keep their word will be treated in kind. Their conversation on how to contact each other was kinda limited. Kissinger expressed the need for a better way to reach each other, and he listed 3 tiers of urgency. 1. A hotline between Washington and Peking for urgent messages. 2. A secure channel via Paris or London to quickly clarify things like misunderstandings. And 3. A diplomatic contact in Warsaw for more technical issues. Zhou basically ignored the first one and said that the Warsaw one was a waste of time, but he agreed to a secure channel and chose the Chinese embassy in Paris for that. The last line here I thought was kind of interesting. Quote, Zhou added that we should continue to pass some non-substantive notes through President Yahya, who had been a good friend. According to Kissinger, Zhou showed a deep bitterness against the Soviets and contempt for their petty tactics. The Soviets, he said, were proceeding down the US road and, quote, spreading their hands out too far. Zhou, as mentioned previously, was concerned about the US colluding with Japan and the USSR to carve up China. Kissinger emphasized that this was not at all their intention and that this would be short-sighted anyways because, quote, the US and China had no real conflicting interests. Kissinger continued, saying that while sometimes consequences of US action might look like collusion, the US would try to avoid this. Kissinger even went so far as to assure Zhou that they would inform the Chinese on any major decisions with other great powers that might affect them. They'd even tried to take their views into account. Kissinger notes that Zhou expressed multiple times that China lacked the economic base to be considered a great power, yet they claimed to have no desire to be perceived as one anyways, citing the great power struggles that emerged after becoming one. They would rather be free from such great power ambitions that only cause trouble, and would prefer to be seen as champions of the less powerful countries of the world. Their attitude towards the current great powers, according to Kissinger, is a mix of hostility, suspicion, and fear. Kissinger, though, doesn't seem to believe them when they say that they don't want to be seen as a great power, saying that, quote, they may be making a virtue out of necessity. With this first face-to-face contact achieved with the Chinese on their home turf, Kissinger had laid the groundwork for President Nixon's visit. As Kissinger put it, that trip would, quote, turn a page in history. Despite this, Kissinger understood that this had to be done delicately, since it might send the wrong message to neighbouring countries like the Soviet Union, Japan, and Taiwan. So the US would have to reaffirm that this wasn't a major shift in direction. As Kissinger puts it, quote, the process we have now started will send enormous shockwaves around the world. He continues, our dealings, both with the Chinese and others, will require reliability, precision, and finesse. If we can master this process, we will have made a revolution. Kissinger had a lot to say about the Chinese. I'll also be using the briefing done after the visits to flesh this out. He starts off with this, quote, 2 qualities in the Chinese came across with particular force during this initial encounter, their inward philosophical tension and their inward strength. For us, this episode is, of course, a major new turn in international relations. For the Chinese communists, it is no less than a personal, intellectual and emotional drama. They have endured 50 years of the Long March, struggle against the Japanese in Kuomintang, and the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. Yet here they were, dealing with arch-capitalists, while what they call a war of liberation was going on at their borders, acting out a drama of philosophic contradictions. The moral ambivalence of this encounter for them was reflected in a certain brooding quality, in the occasional schizophrenia of Zhou's presentations, in the jagged rhythm in drafting the announcement, and the tales of the Cultural Revolution and the Long March of Mao Zedong's inspirational leadership. He continues, thus, these are men in some anguish, yet their long history of past suffering gave them an inner confidence that was reflected in a certain largeness of spirit. Kissinger really notes the internal conflict the Chinese have about this visit. You have to remember, for years they had lived in isolation from their primary enemy, who they had previously condemned as imperialist devils. But now, since relations with their communist neighbour had soured dramatically, the US served as an, ironically, potential ally. Or rather, as Kissinger puts it, quote, they decided that of all of their dangers, we were the least. For America, this was kind of business as usual, but for the Chinese, it was a deeply unsettling event which required a whole new pattern of thinking. In the briefing from 1972, Kissinger talks more about the Chinese leadership and their psychological type. Quote, first, what we are up against. I believe the People's Republic is a different phenomenon from the communist parties and communist countries in Eastern Europe with which we have dealt hitherto. The communist countries in Eastern Europe are of two varieties. They are either countries on whom communism has been imposed by a foreign country, and therefore it has no original indigenous roots, or as in the Soviet Union, it is a revolution that was achieved by a relatively small conspiratorial group, and that, in any rate, has lost its original revolutionary motivation, and is now carried along by bureaucratic inertia and the maintenance of the status quo. This, incidentally, does not make the Soviet Union any easier to deal with. In the People's Republic, we are still dealing with the people who made the revolution. We are dealing with people who, in the 1920s, joined the Communist Party when there was absolutely no chance of their getting to power. This selected out of a certain type of person. We are dealing with people who, in the 1930s, went on the Long March, who in the 1940s fought the Japanese, who in the 1950s fought the United States, who in the 1960s took on the Soviet Union, who in the 1950s tore apart their country on ideological grounds with the Great Leap Forward, and in the 1960s tore apart their country with the Cultural Revolution. For better or worse, they are a different psychological type from the ones we know in the United States, and for that matter in Eastern Europe. If they were pragmatic legalists, as our people, if Mao were a pragmatic legalist, he would be a bank president in Shanghai today. The fact that they are not, the fact that they were willing to enter the career they chose and suffer its deprivations, means that they are men of very great philosophical, almost religious motivation. Their ideology, indeed their almost religious fervour, happens to be quite contradictory to ours, but its sincerity and intensity cannot be questioned by anybody who has dealt with them. Now, Kissinger also notes just how meticulous and firm on principle that the Chinese were. They paid very close attention on not only the wording used for joint announcements, but even the spirit of them. The Chinese said to Kissinger, quote, with us, speaking of themselves, our word counts. Therefore, when we say something, we do it. Knowing this, Kissinger really stresses on how the US is to carry on in its dealings with China. Quote, I know, on the other hand, there are people who engage in a pro-Chinese nostalgia and who believe that all we have to do now that we have opened up is to get their revolutionary ballet over here and our scientists over there, and all our problems will disappear. These people, the Chinese, are very tough. They are very purposeful. And it is absolutely essential that we conquer our penchant for cheap little maneuvers, because the only hope we have is by dealing with them reliably and steadily. There is nothing we can do for them right now. There is little, if anything, that they can do for us right now. But if we begin to set a course, then, as things evolve, our policies in certain areas can, where our interests are similar, at least avoid conflicts and perhaps support each other. Now, this is what is involved here. With the Soviets, things tend to become tests of strength on almost any issue. When we make an agreement with the Soviets, I assume that they will double-cross us in the translation to begin with, and in the execution the next. That's understood, and it's all taken in good spirits. With the Chinese, while the basic hostility may be greater, the immediate problem is to conduct a steady, reliable, long-range policy. The only thing that can make this worthwhile to them is to make them believe that they are not dealing with individuals that they can agree with, but with individuals who have a view of the world that they can understand and relate to, and who have the steadiness of purpose to execute it. And in a way, that is true of us. It requires some delicacy. We have problems with some of our allies in Asia. We have a delicate road to hoe with the Soviet Union. Because with all the comparisons I have made between the Chinese and the Soviet Union, the fact is we are determined to stay on good terms with the both of them. But we will not let ourselves be drawn into their parochial quarrels. All of this requires great skill and considerable diplomatic insight. At the same time, I think it has opened up prospects for the future which at least are up to our own abilities to implement, and which we are no longer just prisoners of events. As mentioned in Kissinger's speech there's considerable differences between the Chinese and the Soviets in their diplomatic style. Not to throw insults, but by Kissinger's account, the Soviets seem a little more crooked in the way they do diplomacy. For example, Kissinger told Joe that the Soviets had used their own different English translations for the May 20th SALT announcement. Apparently, Zhou showed obvious contempt at that, assuring Kissinger that the Chinese would never resort to such a gambit. Kissinger goes into detail actually about the Chinese negotiation style. Quote, in dealing with them, however, there are a number of characteristics in which they are quite different from Hal Sonnenfeld's client. When you deal with the Soviets, they start with the assumption that they haven't made a mistake since 1917, and we haven't done anything right since 1776. That no proposition we make to them has any conceivable merit, but because they are talking to us and therefore presumably they want to deal, they will reluctantly make the minimum concessions that are necessary, but within a framework that makes it perfectly obvious that at the first opportunity they will break it. The first time I was in China, when we were drafting the July 15th announcement, they asked, quote, how shall we proceed? I thought I was dealing with Dobrinin, and so I said, quote, well, the way to do it is for you to write down your things, and we'll write down our things, and then we'll start trading them off. They said, that is not the way to do it. The way to do it is, let's first talk about what you must have, and what we must have, and if we understand each other, we'll find the words easily enough. Now, that talk turned out to be very prolonged and took better part of the night, but they were men of their word. Once we had done it, we went off to draft our version of the announcement, and they went off to draft their version of the announcement. One of the smarter things we did was to ask them to table theirs first. It turned out that theirs was better than the one we were preparing to table. Kissinger was highly impressed with Zhou Enlai. He wrote, quote, he spoke with an almost matter-of-fact clarity and eloquence. He was equally at home in philosophic sweeps, historical analysis, tactical probing, and light repartee. His command of facts, and in particular his knowledge of American events, was remarkable. He insisted on admitting the faults in their society, and protesting that their lavish hospitality was only what they should do. There was little wasted motion, either in his words or his movements. Both reflected the brooding inner tension of a man concerned with the revolutionary fire of the next generation, and the massive daily problem of caring for 750 million people. One who endured the tribulations of the Long March, and was now inviting the President of the United States to visit his capital. Zhou was also genial and urbane, with a refreshing sense of humour. He displayed an easy egalitarianism with his interpreters who had a free, though respectful relationship with him, or with all of our party, who he consistently ushered into and out of elevators in front of him. And he was considerate in his genuine concern when one of my colleagues wasn't feeling well, in briefing me just before my departure of events in the world from which I had been insulated, and in making sure that we would continue to use the Yaya channel occasionally because, quote, one should not burn bridges that have been useful. In short, Zhou Enlai ranks with Charles de Gaulle as the most impressive foreign statesman I have met. Despite all of this praise, Kissinger had some sharper words too. Quote, of course, these people were on their best behaviour. These were the cream of their current elite, and it is inconceivable that the next generation there will produce leaders tempered by such experiences. Almost all of the positive qualities we saw are Chinese, not communist, and can be found in Taiwan or Singapore or San Francisco. Much of their ideology is distasteful, and living in China today would be a numbing, depressing experience. They are certainly fanatically tough. They do not wish us well. Their new society has been purchased at a terrible cost, in freedom, spontaneity, colour, and family life. But the present generation of leaders understand the big conceptions. Our dealings will be difficult, especially as we inaugurate a brand new relationship. The rewards and risks will be great, but if we keep our nerves and are clear about our purpose, we can start a new historical course.
In pursuance of that goal, I sent Dr. Kissinger, my assistant for national security affairs, to Peking during his recent world tour for the purpose of having talks with Premier Zhou Enlai. The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Premier Zhou Enlai and Dr. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's assistant for national security affairs, held talks in Peking from July 9 to 11, 1971. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
So now that Nixon's planned visit had been announced, Kissinger would make one more non-secret visit to China. I won't dwell on this too long. Basically, they needed to iron out a few details in person before the president touched down in China. Kissinger goes back to China in October, and Zhou welcomes him back like an old friend. He raises a toast to Kissinger, who, quote, courageously entered the, quote, land of mystery. He went on to toast to, quote, friendship between the great American and the great Chinese people, as well as to the health of Kissinger himself. But the main reason he was there was to iron out the joint communique that each country would sign that would act as a guide to normalize their relations. Now, initially, Kissinger's draft of the communique seemed to do this common tactic of the time where they'd not really mention any major differences and instead emphasize commonalities. Essentially, it was sweet-sounding filler. So the Chinese made their own version of the communique, which they then showed to Chairman Mao, who hates it. Mao doesn't even like the idea of making such a communique, but Zhou basically tells him that it was the Americans' request and that it might be difficult to reject. Mao didn't like all the empty words in it, so the Chinese just redo the draft altogether. This new draft was in a new style and broke all the conventional rules for this kind of thing. There was different sections. The first section was split into two sides, the Chinese side and the US side. The Chinese part of the draft starts off with strong revolutionary language, sending out their strongest positions on international matters and crucial issues. The Chinese then left the US side blank for them to say whatever they wanted. Then, only after the strongest statements had been made, the rest of the communique would involve the commonalities and aims for the future, particularly the future of Taiwan. So they show this new draft to Kissinger, and at first he doesn't like it, but after some deliberation changes his mind and accepts this new communique idea. So the US then writes their side of the communique, and things were going smoothly until the issue of Taiwan emerged again. This was a particularly sticky topic. The Chinese viewed Taiwan as rightfully theirs, the US wanted to keep on good terms with Beijing, but also didn't want to completely abandon the Taiwanese government either. So some clever wording had to be used to move things along. The Chinese weren't enthused about that, but they went along with it. As Nixon had said that he wanted to bring China out of angry isolation, in February of 1972 he did just that, when in a symbolic gesture of good faith, Nixon shook the hand of Zhou Enlai in front of the world. This was more important than it seems. Years earlier, at a Geneva conference in 1954, the Americans had given a real dig to the Chinese when Eisenhower's Secretary of State, Foster Dulles, had refused to shake Zhou Enlai's hand. But now, with Nixon, things had changed. It wasn't long before Nixon and Kissinger had a sudden meeting with Mao himself, alongside Zhou Enlai. This meeting wasn't guaranteed, because Mao had actually been suffering from a severe heart condition. The Chinese had to scramble to even make him presentable. This meeting, however, was considered a success, even as unbelievable as it was. Both sides got what they wanted. The Americans got Mao's approval, something deeply necessary for anything to happen in China, and Mao got the most powerful man in the world, who himself was an ardent anti-communist, to give China the legitimacy that it strived for. Later in the trip, February 27th, 1972, Nixon and Zhou Enlai would officially sign the communique that he and Kissinger had spent hours deliberating over. It was formerly known as the Shanghai Communique. Even though the issue of Taiwan was still a sticking point, ambiguous wording allowed for some maneuver and a general acceptance between China and the US that this issue, as important as it was for another time. For now, the normalization of relations took precedent. Indeed, it was this groundwork, led by Nixon, Kissinger, Zhou Enlai, and to some extent Mao, that would open up China to the West, and make it into the nation-state that we see today. So when China calls Kissinger an, quote, old friend, this is why they mean it.